For most of history, two-thirds of our planet's oceans have been a lawless frontier. Think about that for a second. A space bigger than all the continents combined with virtually no rules. But in early 2026, that changed. A landmark global agreement finally became international law, offering a real, tangible solution for our blue planet. This is the story of the High Seas Treaty. So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the problem, this idea of a lawless ocean. Then we'll get into the solution, this new constitution for the seas. After that, we'll dive into the nuts and bolts of how the treaty actually works, explore its crucial role as a shield for our climate, and finally, check in on the global race to put it all into action.
All right, so first up, to really appreciate the solution, you have to understand the sheer scale of the problem the world was up against before this treaty. We're talking about a vast blue expanse that covers nearly half of the entire Earth's surface. For all intents and purposes, it was a true Wild West. It was a place where any country had the right to fish, to ship, to do research, but almost no one had the responsibility to protect it.
And the result of that? Well, it's pretty staggering. Before 2026, less than 1% of the high seas were protected. That meant the great migratory routes for whales, ancient deep-sea corals, and countless other species were just completely exposed to overfishing, to pollution, and to the growing threat of deep-sea mining. But then, after a really remarkable display of global cooperation, the world finally hammered out a solution. And you have to understand, this wasn't just another agreement. It was a fundamental rewriting of our entire relationship with the global ocean.
And this didn't just happen overnight, not by a long shot. This was a diplomatic marathon that stretched over 2 decades. The talks nearly collapsed more than once, but they finally got the treaty adopted in 2023, and it officially crossed the finish line to become binding international law in early 2026.
And this table, well, it really lays out the night and day difference we're talking about. We go from almost no protected areas to a framework with a target of protecting 30% of the high seas. We go from almost zero oversight on new projects to mandatory environmental checks. And, crucially, we go from protecting animals only near the coast to protecting them across their entire journey. It really marks a new era of shared responsibility.
So, it sounds great in theory, right? But how does it actually work? What are the mechanisms that turn this legal text into a genuine life support system for the ocean?
Well, it all comes down to 4 key pillars. The first is creating the legal power to establish huge ocean sanctuaries, or MPAs. The second is forcing any new industrial activity to go through strict environmental checks. The third is making sure the benefits from the ocean's genetic treasures are shared fairly with everyone. And the fourth is a commitment to help developing nations play their full part.
Let's make this real. Take the Emperor seamounts in the North Pacific. These underwater mountains are home to black corals that are over 4,000 years old. I mean, they were alive when the pyramids were being built. The threat has been this brutal practice called bottom trawling, which just scrapes the seafloor clean. The solution? For the first time, this treaty gives us the legal power to say, no, stop, and protect these incredible living monuments.
Now, another huge piece of this is the race for what some are calling blue gold. We're talking about marine genetic resources. It's the unique DNA, the genetic code, hidden in some of the deepest, strangest creatures on Earth, and it could hold the key to new medicines and breakthroughs. And here's the absolute game changer. The treaty says these resources are the common heritage of humankind. That means a wealthy corporation can't just go down there, find the cure for a disease, and keep all the profits. It establishes that this genetic library belongs to all of us, and the benefits have to be shared fairly.
The treaty also brings in a powerful dose of common sense, a look before you leap principle. For the first time, any major industrial activity out on the high seas, and you can think of things like deep-sea mining, has to go through a rigorous public environmental impact assessment before it can even be considered.
But it goes even deeper than that, and this is the really clever part. The assessments can't just look at one project in a vacuum. They are legally required to consider the cumulative impacts. That means you have to factor in the bigger picture of climate change, the warming, the acidification, all the stress the ocean is already under.
And this treaty is about more than just fish and corals. It's about people. It's a landmark for equity. It legally recognizes that the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples is a vital source of wisdom for conservation. It also mandates real support. We're talking funding and technology for developing countries, even calling out coastal African states specifically, so everyone can be an active steward of our shared ocean. Okay, so we've talked about protecting life in the ocean.
But this treaty also does something else, something absolutely critical for all of us. It acts as a powerful shield for the climate by protecting one of the ocean's greatest superpowers.
It sounds like science fiction, but every single day, the largest migration on Earth takes place. Billions upon billions of tiny creatures move from the surface to the deep and back again. As they do this, they act as a giant biological pump, pulling our carbon emissions out of the atmosphere and locking that carbon safely in the deep sea. So by protecting these tiny animals, we're actually protecting one of the planet's biggest defenses against climate change.
All right, so the law is on the books. The treaty exists. The big question now is, what happens next? How does this piece of paper become a reality out on the water?
Well, for the treaty to come to life, it needed a critical mass of countries to formally ratify it. 60 of them, to be exact. And as you can see from this map, that's exactly what happened. The world really is coming together on this, with the green countries having fully ratified and the blue ones on their way. And in fact, that number has already climbed past 80 nations. Now, the work really begins. This is where it gets exciting. The next big step is the first ever Ocean Conference of the Parties later this year, where countries will start proposing the very first sanctuaries out in the high seas.
But look, no major global agreements is ever perfect, and it's so important to be clear-eyed and honest about the challenges that remain. So what's missing? What was left on the negotiating table?
Well, the big one, the elephant in the room, is industrial fishing. It was a painful compromise, really. In order to get the deal done and to get everyone to agree, negotiators had to leave the direct regulation of fishing fleets outside the treaty's scope. That means it has to be tackled indirectly by deciding where to draw the lines for these new protected areas.
But even with that gap, you just can't overstate what a massive achievement this is. The feeling among world leaders is one of profound hope. It's just as this quote says, it's a lifeline. It's proof that when we actually work together, we can begin to tackle the planet's biggest problems.
Because in the end, this treaty isn't the finish line, it's the starting line. For the first time, we have the legal tools we've desperately needed for decades. The treaty has given us the blueprint. The critical question we're all left with now is, will we have the will to actually use it?